Welcome to UBI Unplugged, breaking down the future of income.
Hey everyone, excited to dive into this today. It's a big topic.
Yeah, big and potentially complicated. We'll see.
Complicated, yes, but also potentially transformative. We're talking about universal basic income today, and specifically how it might impact Creative Commons and open source culture. Think about it. What happens when everyone has a basic economic foundation? How does that change the landscape of intellectual property and creative work?
It's a fascinating question. I think the core idea, the promise of UBI, is that it frees people to pursue things that aren't necessarily immediately profitable, like art, open source projects, community initiatives, things that benefit society but don't always pay the bills.
Okay, but let's be real. Frees people to pursue their passion sounds great in theory, but who is paying for this freedom? I mean, somebody has to work, right? And what happens when you disincentivize people from traditional employment? Because, let's face it, some jobs are just necessary.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there are a lot of different answers out there. Funding mechanisms could involve things like progressive taxation, closing tax loopholes, maybe even a carbon tax. The point is to redistribute wealth in a way that sustains the UBI and allows people to contribute in ways that aren't solely dictated by market forces.
And that redistribution is key. It can't just be about printing money. We need to think about the knock-on effects on inflation on the value of the dollar. How do we ensure that a UBI doesn't just become another form of poverty, where the cost of living rises to swallow the basic income whole?
Exactly. It's a system, right? And you can't just tweak one part without affecting everything else. People talk about UBI like it's this magic bullet, but where's the proof? Show me a large-scale successful implementation that hasn't bankrupted the country.
Well, there haven't been widespread nationally implemented UBI programs, you're right, but there have been smaller scale pilot programs with promising results. Think about Stockton, California, for example. They gave a group of residents $500 a month with no strings attached. And the initial data showed people used it not to, sit around and do nothing, but to get back on their feet, find better jobs, and even start businesses.
Right, and those pilot programs are incredibly valuable for informing policy. But scaling those up to a national level is a different beast altogether. The complexities of managing a nationwide system, preventing fraud, adjusting for regional cost of living differences, it's a huge undertaking.
And what about the open source aspect? I'm still not seeing the connection. You give people money, and suddenly they're all going to become coding geniuses contributing to GitHub. I don't buy it.
It's not about turning everyone into a coding genius. It's about removing the economic pressure that forces people into jobs they might not be passionate about. Think about the aspiring artist who's stuck working a dead-end job just to pay rent. With the UBI, they have the freedom to dedicate more time to their art, to hone their skills, to contribute to the Creative Commons without worrying about starving.
And it's not just artists, right? It's also about fostering innovation. Think about the open source software movement. A lot of those projects are driven by volunteers who are passionate about creating free and accessible tools. A UBI could provide those individuals with the economic security to dedicate even more time and energy to those projects.
Okay, I see that point. But what about the people who are already contributing to open source? Will they just stop working if they get a UBI? Will innovation grind to a halt because everyone's chilling at home, collecting their free money?
I think that's a fear, but it's not borne out by the evidence. Most people want to be productive, to contribute to society in some way. A UBI doesn't eliminate the desire to work or create. It just changes the equation. It gives people more agency over their time and their labor.
And it could lead to a more diverse and equitable creative landscape. Right now, access to the Creative Commons is often limited by economic privilege. If you're struggling to make ends meet, you don't have the time or resources to contribute to open source projects or pursue artistic endeavors. A UBI could level the playing field, allowing more people from different backgrounds to participate.
Okay, fair enough. I can see the potential benefits for creativity and open source development. But what about the intellectual property side of things? If everyone has a UBI, does that mean we should just abolish copyright and patents? Should everything be free and open source?
I don't think it's about abolishing intellectual property altogether. It's about rethinking its role in a UBI-supported society. Maybe we need shorter copyright terms or more flexible licensing options. Maybe we need to explore alternative funding models for creators, like patronage or crowdfunding.
Exactly. A UBA could actually strengthen the Creative Commons by providing creators with a safety net, allowing them to experiment with different business models and licensing arrangements. They wouldn't be forced to lock down their work behind restrictive copyrights just to make a living.
But wouldn't that disincentivize innovation in the long run? If you can't protect your inventions with patents, why bother investing in research and development? Why would anyone create new medicines or technologies if they can't profit from them?
That's a valid concern, but I think there are other incentives besides monetary profit. Think about the intrinsic motivation of solving problems, of contributing to human knowledge. And let's not forget about the potential for reputation and recognition. In a UBI supported society, people might be more motivated to create things that benefit society rather than just things that make them rich.
And we could also explore alternative reward systems for innovation, maybe government grants or prizes for groundbreaking discoveries, or tax breaks for companies that open source their technologies. There are a lot of different ways to incentivize innovation without relying solely on patents.
Okay, so you're saying that UBI could lead to a more collaborative and equitable creative landscape where people are free to pursue their passions and contribute to the common good. But how do we get there? What are the concrete steps we need to take to make UBI a reality?
That's the million-dollar question again, and it starts with building public support, educating people about the potential benefits of UBI, addressing their concerns, and demonstrating that it's a viable policy option. We need to show people that UBI isn't just some utopian fantasy, but a practical solution to the challenges of the 21st century.
And that means addressing the practical challenges, figuring out the optimal funding mechanism, designing a system that's resistant to fraud and abuse, and ensuring that it doesn't exacerbate existing inequalities. We need to do our homework and develop a UBI proposal that's both ambitious and realistic.
So basically, a lot more research, a lot more pilot programs, and a lot more public debate. It's not going to happen overnight. And I'm still not convinced it's the answer to all our problems, but I'm willing to keep an open mind.
And that's all we can ask for, right? To have an open mind and to be willing to explore new possibilities. Because the future work is changing and we need to be prepared to adapt. A UBI might not be the perfect solution, but it's a conversation worth having.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue with no easy answers, but it's a conversation that's essential for shaping a more just and equitable future.
Well said. I guess we'll just have to wait and see what the future holds. And hope that it doesn't involve robot overlords taxing us into oblivion to fund their own UBI.
Let's hope not. Thanks for joining us on UBI Unplugged. Until next time.
Thanks for listening.
Later.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. I've been thinking a lot about the current political climate, especially reading about some Trump voters expressing frustration and even betrayal over unfulfilled promises. It really highlights the economic anxieties people are facing. That ties directly into the UBI conversation.
Absolutely. I saw that too. The disconnect is real. People voted for promises of economic improvement, and many haven't seen that materialize. But, and this is a big but, is UBI really the answer to fixing that broken trust? Or are we just offering another empty promise that will ultimately backfire?
There it is. The core question. People are desperate for solutions, and UBI gets thrown around like it's a magic wand. But I keep thinking about the logistics. How do you convince people who feel betrayed by the system now that a UBI, which requires even more faith in the system, will actually work for them?
That's where the messaging becomes critical. It's not about blind faith. It's about presenting UBI as a pragmatic solution to economic precarity, a safety net that's there regardless of political whims. It's about showing, not just telling, how it would directly address their economic concerns.
And that requires a really robust policy framework. We need to address concerns about inflation, workforce participation, and the potential for unintended consequences. A half-baked UBI proposal will only fuel the existing distrust.
Exactly. People aren't stupid. They can smell a rat. If the plan is riddled with loopholes or relies on unrealistic economic assumptions, it's dead on arrival.
Right. So it's about building a transparent and accountable system and demonstrating the potential for long-term societal benefits. It's not just about giving people money. It's about investing in a more equitable and resilient future.
Okay, but let's talk about that equitable future. Because what happens when Congress, which is demonstrably dysfunctional, is tasked with implementing and managing a UBI program? How do we prevent political gridlock from undermining the entire system?
Now you're talking. That's my biggest fear. We're relying on the same people who can't agree on basic infrastructure to manage a massive social program. It's a recipe for disaster.
That's why we need to explore alternative mechanisms for implementation and oversight. Maybe an independent agency or a system of checks and balances that limits political interference. We need to design a UBI program that can withstand the inevitable political storms.
That sounds great in theory, but how do you actually create that kind of insulation? Congress controls the purse strings. They can always defund or dismantle any program they don't like.
Plus, the political opposition would be fierce. You'd have people on both sides of the aisle attacking it for different reasons. It would be a constant battle to keep it afloat.
True, but that's why building broad-based public support is so crucial. If people see UBI as a vital lifeline, they'll be more likely to defend it from political attacks. And we need to build coalitions across different political groups, emphasizing the common ground and the shared benefits.
And that common ground might be harder to find than we think, because the economic anxieties are often tied to deeper cultural and social issues. It's not just about the money, it's about identity, belonging, and a sense of purpose.
Bingo. You can't just throw money at the problem and expect it to go away. People are feeling left behind, and they're looking for something more than just a handout.
And that's where the open source and Creative Commons aspect comes back in. A UBI can provide people with the space and resources to find that purpose, to contribute to their communities, and to build a more meaningful life. It's about empowering people to be active participants in shaping their own future.
But how do we ensure that people actually use that freedom productively? What if they just retreat into themselves, becoming more isolated and disengaged?
That's my worry. We're already seeing increasing rates of social isolation and mental health problems. Will UBI just exacerbate those trends?
That's why a UBI needs to be coupled with other social support systems, access to mental health care, community centers, educational opportunities. We need to create an environment where people feel supported and connected.
And that requires a holistic approach to policymaking. We can't just focus on the economic aspects of UBI. We need to consider the social, cultural, and psychological dimensions as well.
Easier said than done. Government agencies are notorious for working in silos. Getting them to coordinate and collaborate effectively is a major challenge.
Agreed. It requires a fundamental shift in the way we think about governance. We need to move away from top-down, centralized control, and embrace more collaborative and participatory models.
And that brings us back to the open source ethos. UBI could be seen as a way to open source the economy, to empower individuals and communities to take control of their own destinies.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection. It's not just about the money. It's about creating a more decentralized and democratic society.
Exactly. It's about fostering a culture of innovation, creativity, and collaboration, and that requires a fundamental rethinking of our economic and social systems.
So UBI as a catalyst for systemic change. It's a bold vision, but it's also a very risky one. We need to proceed with caution and be prepared to adapt along the way.
Cautious optimism. That's probably the best approach. But I'm still not sold on the idea that UBI is the silver bullet we've been looking for.
Maybe not a silver bullet, but perhaps a valuable tool in our toolbox. A tool that can help us build a more just and equitable future for all.
A tool that requires careful handling and constant monitoring, but a tool that's worth exploring nonetheless.
All right, I'm in. Let's keep digging. What about the story about the economic struggles faced by the Black community in Philadelphia? Apparently, some voters there turned to Trump and now regret that vote.
That's a poignant example of the deep-seated economic inequalities that are driving political polarization. People are desperate for change, and they're willing to take a chance on anyone who promises to deliver it. But when those promises go unfulfilled, the result is disillusionment and anger.
And that anger can be easily exploited. We need to offer people a more constructive and sustainable path forward. But is UBI really the most effective way to address the specific economic challenges faced by communities like the Black community in Philadelphia?
That's the key question. Are we treating the symptoms or the disease? Is UBI just a band-aid solution to a much deeper problem of systemic racism and economic injustice?
It's not a band-aid. It's a foundational element. UBI can provide a basic level of economic security that allows people to address those deeper issues. It can empower them to start businesses, invest in their communities, and advocate for policy changes that promote racial and economic justice.
But how do we ensure that UBI actually benefits those communities? What if it's just absorbed by existing inequalities, with landlords raising rents and businesses raising prices in response to the increased demand?
Exactly. It could just end up being a transfer of wealth from the government to the wealthy, leaving the poor no better off than before.
That's why we need to implement UBI in conjunction with other policies that address those structural inequalities. Rent control, affordable housing initiatives, anti-discrimination laws. We need to create a level playing field so that UBI can truly empower marginalized communities.
And we need to be mindful of the potential for unintended consequences. What if UBI leads to a decline in workforce participation in certain sectors, creating labor shortages and disrupting the economy?
Or what if it discourages people from pursuing education and training, leading to a less skilled workforce in the long run?
Now, those are legitimate concerns, but we can mitigate those risks by designing UBI in a way that incentivizes work and education. Maybe we can offer additional benefits to people who pursue job training or volunteer in their communities.
And we need to invest in education and job training programs to ensure that people have the skills they need to succeed in a changing economy. UBI can't be a substitute for opportunity. It needs to be a complement to it.
So basically, a UBI isn't a standalone solution. It's part of a larger ecosystem of policies and programs that need to work together to create a more just and equitable society.
Exactly. It's about creating a virtuous cycle where UBI empowers people to invest in their communities, which leads to greater economic opportunity, which in turn strengthens the UBI system.
And that requires a long-term commitment to social and economic justice. It's not something that can be achieved overnight. It's a continuous process of experimentation, evaluation, and adaptation.
All right, I'm starting to get it. But I'm still skeptical. Show me the money, literally. How are we going to pay for all of this?
That's the perennial question, isn't it? And there are a lot of different answers out there. We could start by closing tax loopholes that benefit the wealthy and corporations. We could implement a progressive tax system where those who earn the most contribute the most. And we could explore alternative revenue sources like a carbon tax or a wealth tax.
But those options are all politically challenging. The wealthy and corporations will fight tooth and nail to protect their tax breaks. And any new tax will face fierce opposition from both sides of the aisle.
Plus, you have to worry about the economic impact. Will higher taxes discourage investment and innovation? Will they drive businesses overseas?
Those are valid concerns, but we can design tax policies that minimize those risks. We can focus on closing loopholes and taxing unproductive wealth rather than penalizing productive investment. And we can work with other countries to create a global tax system that prevents tax evasion and promotes fair competition.
And we need to be realistic about the costs of UBI. It's not going to be cheap. But we also need to consider the costs of not implementing UBI, the costs of poverty, inequality, and social unrest. Those costs are very real, and they're only going to get higher if we don't address them.
So it's a question of priorities. Are we willing to invest in a more just and equitable future, even if it means making some difficult choices?
Exactly. It's about recognizing that UBI is not just an expense, it's an investment in human potential, in economic stability, and in social cohesion.
An investment that requires careful planning, constant monitoring, and a willingness to adapt along the way. But an investment that could pay off handsomely in the long run.
All right, I'm still not completely convinced, but I'm starting to see the potential, and I'm definitely willing to keep exploring the idea. But let's move on to something else. I saw this article about Trump's tariffs and how they're potentially impacting inflation.
Yes, the tariffs. It's another example of how seemingly simple economic interventions can have complex and unintended consequences. Trump's Liberation Day tariffs were supposed to bring jobs back to America and protect domestic industries, but the reality is much more nuanced.
Exactly. And the initial dip in inflation, even with those tariffs temporarily rolled back, doesn't necessarily mean everything is rosy. It could just be a temporary blip before the underlying inflationary pressures kick back in.
So basically, Trump's economic policies are a mixed bag at best, and they highlight the need for a more nuanced and sustainable approach to economic stabilization.
And that's where UBI comes back in. It can provide a buffer against economic shocks, like those caused by trade wars or unexpected inflation. It can help people weather the storm and maintain their economic security, regardless of what's happening in the global economy.
But wouldn't UBI itself contribute to inflation? If everyone has more money to spend, wouldn't that drive up prices?
That's the big fear, right? UBI becomes self-defeating as the cost of living rises to swallow the basic income whole.
That's why we need to design UBI in a way that minimizes inflationary pressures. We need to ensure that the money supply doesn't grow too rapidly and that the increased demand is met with increased supply. And we need to implement policies that prevent businesses from exploiting the situation by raising prices unnecessarily.
And we need to be prepared to adjust the UBI level in response to changes in the cost of living. It can't be a fixed amount. It needs to be indexed to inflation so that it maintains its real value over time.
So, a dynamic UBI system that's constantly being adjusted to reflect changing economic conditions. Sounds complicated.
It is complicated, but the alternative is to leave people vulnerable to economic shocks and to perpetuate the cycle of poverty and inequality.
And that vulnerability can have far-reaching consequences. It can lead to social unrest, political instability, and a decline in overall well-being.
All right, I'm starting to see the big picture. UBI is a tool for economic resilience, a way to protect people from the vagaries of the market and the whims of politicians.
Exactly. It's about creating a more stable and predictable economic environment where people can plan for the future and pursue their goals without fear of falling through the cracks.
A future where everyone has a basic level of economic security and where everyone has the opportunity to contribute to society in a meaningful way.
Sounds nice. Almost too nice, but I'm willing to keep listening. What else have you got?
Well, staying on the topic of potentially problematic government actions, I've been reading about some pretty aggressive immigration enforcement practices, like those arrests on Tennessee roads. It's concerning.
Yeah, that's definitely raising red flags. The potential for racial profiling and the disproportionate targeting of immigrant communities is a huge concern, especially considering how those actions can instill fear and disrupt local economies.
Okay, but are we sure it's profiling? The authorities are saying they stopped people for driver behavior violations, like broken tail lights. Seems like a legitimate reason, at least on the surface.
That's what they're saying, but we need to be critical. How do we know those stops weren't just a pretext for targeting people based on ethnicity or perceived immigration status? We need transparency and data to ensure that the Highway Patrol's criteria for assessing driver behavior are consistently applied in an unbiased way.
Exactly. And even if the stops were technically justified, the sheer scale of the operation is alarming. Arresting over 100 people on a single day sends a chilling message to immigrant communities and creates an environment of fear and distrust.
So, what's the connection to UBI? Are you saying that a UBI would somehow prevent these kinds of immigration raids?
Not directly, no, but UBI can provide a safety net for vulnerable populations, including immigrants, mitigating the fear and instability caused by these kinds of actions. It can help stabilize communities and provide a platform for long-term economic advancement.
And it could reduce the incentive for undocumented immigration in the first place. If people have a basic level of economic security in their home countries, they may be less likely to risk their lives to come to the United States.
Okay, that's a bit of a stretch. People immigrate for all sorts of reasons, not just economic ones. Political persecution, war, family reunification.
True, but economic hardship is a major factor. And UBI can address that underlying issue, providing people with a reason to stay in their home countries and build a better life there.
And it could also help to reduce the exploitation of undocumented workers in the United States. If people have a UBI, they're less likely to accept substandard wages and working conditions.
Okay, I see that point. It could level the playing field and give undocumented workers more bargaining power.
Exactly. It's about empowering people to stand up for their rights and to demand fair treatment.
And it could also help to reduce the burden on social safety nets. Undocumented immigrants are often ineligible for government assistance, which means they rely on charities and community organizations for support. UBI could provide them with a basic level of economic security, reducing their reliance on these already stretched resources.
So, UBI is a way to address the root causes of immigration and to create a more just and equitable society for everyone, regardless of their immigration status.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of every human being and ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
A lofty goal, but a necessary one. And UBI could be a valuable tool in achieving it. But we need to be mindful of the potential challenges and to address them proactively.
And we need to be realistic about the political obstacles. Implementing UBI in the current political climate will be an uphill battle.
Agreed. But we can't let those obstacles deter us. We need to keep fighting for a more just and equitable future, one step at a time.
All right, let's wrap things up. It's been a long and winding conversation, but I think we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, my brain hurts. But I'm also a little bit more optimistic than I was at the beginning.
That's all I can ask for. I still believe that UBI has the potential to transform our society for the better, but it's not a magic bullet and it requires careful planning and implementation.
Agreed. It's a complex issue with no easy answers, but it's a conversation worth having, and it's a policy worth exploring.
All right, I'm in. Let's keep digging. And let's hope that the future is a little bit brighter than it looks right now.
Here's to a brighter future. Thanks for joining us on UBI Unplugged. Until next time.
Thanks for listening.
Peace out.